Sejam todos bem-vindos a mais um episódio do nosso podcast Com Base em Quê? Estou aqui com o Rodrigo Dufloth, um advogado experiente na assessoria jurídica e de negócios de empresas estrangeiras que querem fazer negócios no Brasil. E esse é o tema do nosso episódio de hoje. Você vai ver que a gente fez um episódio um pouquinho diferente. O episódio está todo em inglês, em razão de demandas que nós recebemos de clientes, de parceiros ou de empresas estrangeiras que assistem ao nosso podcast e estão interessados em fazer negócios no Brasil. Rodrigo, o que você pode falar aqui para o nosso público em língua portuguesa, para depois convidá-los a assistir o episódio inteiro em língua inglesa?
Legal, Renato. Realmente, a ideia, a gente fez aí algumas perguntas bem básicas, né, para um estrangeiro que considera vir para o Brasil, fazer negócios aqui. Como, né, o nosso podcast aqui fala bastante de compliance e governança, a gente pensou também que, e dadas algumas demandas que recebemos aí do pessoal de fora com interesse no Brasil, a gente achou que seria interessante fazer um episódio aí, de novo, com o básico para um estrangeiro constituir uma empresa no Brasil, o que tem que saber. Claro que é um assunto que daria uma legal opinion, né, enfim, um parecer e várias reuniões, mas a ideia foi em alguns minutinhos, pelo menos dar ali uma ideia, né? Então, se você aí conhece alguém, ou algum amigo, ou alguém interessado em conhecer um pouquinho do Brasil que não fala português, fizemos esse episódio aí em inglês, no melhor do nosso conhecimento aqui, né? Mas com inglês que a gente acha aí legal, pelo menos para ter um nível para o pessoal entender minimamente como entrar no Brasil. Então, esperamos aí que o pessoal goste e dúvidas, comentários, críticas são muito bem-vindas.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of our podcast. If this is your first time here with us, thank you for joining us. And if you are a returning listener, it's great to have you back. In today's episode, we are kicking off a practical conversation for foreign investors who are looking at Brazil and wondering where to start. Brazil is a market with enormous potential, but is also a jurisdiction with its own legal, corporate, and financial particularities. And when it comes to setting up a company here, understanding those basics up front can make all the difference between a smooth entry and costly surprises down the road. So this episode is a true 101 on setting a new co in Brazil. We'll talk about what a foreigner needs to know before incorporating, the most common corporate structures used in practice, whether there's a minimum capital requirement, how the inflow and outflow of funds works under Brazilian law, and which key legal areas like labor and tax deserve special attention to protect your investment. So if you are considering entering the Brazilian market or advising someone who is, this episode is designed to give you a clear, practical starting point. I'm here today with Rodrigo. Hi, Rodrigo. Thanks for joining us. And so for us to get started, when a foreign investor first thinks about setting up a company in Brazil, what are the key misconceptions and blind spots you see most often? And what do they really need to understand before taking this first step? Welcome to our podcast.
Thank you very much, Renato. I would say that the first thing to be considered for a foreigner, mainly to set up a new co in Brazil, right? Assuming that the foreigner would do business locally in Brazil. So setting up a new co with a foreign shareholder. I would say that the first thing to bear in mind is the need to have a local legal representative who must be a Brazilian resident. That's very important. So it's not possible to have like a NILCO with a foreigner as an officer. We need to have a legal representative for the foreign shareholder. So that's one thing. That must be done via a specific power of attorney that needs to be signed abroad, notarized, apostille, and then registered in Brazil with sworn translation into Portuguese. So that usually takes some time, so mainly a couple of weeks or so. So the first thing to bear in mind is please consider having someone local in Brazil to be appointed as this local representative. It could be a lawyer, could be the potential officer of the local entity, could be anyone as long as the person is a Brazilian resident with powers to receive service of process in Brazil and to represent locally the foreigner. So that's, I would say, the first thing to consider, right? Because we will need to have a local tax ID for the foreigner, and also a registration with the Central Bank of Brazil for the inflow of funds. That's something that we can discuss afterwards. But this, I would say, is the key thing to be considered. And also, at least one officer also must be in Brazil. There is some debate regarding the possibility of having a foreign officer, but I would highly recommend to have, since it will be needed to have at least one legal representative of the foreign shareholder locally. Usually what the foreigner does is having that same person also as the officer or a different one, but that's, I would say, the most common path. So having someone local to be appointed in Brazil. That's I would say, the first thing. And also, for sure, we should consider what's the corporate purpose of the entity, because in Brazil, under Brazilian law, it's not possible to say like the company will do everything that's lawful. I know that's something that happens in the US or similar jurisdictions, but in Brazil, we need to be very specific on what the company will do. So what will be the business for the company. In Brazil, there's a specific list with the Brazilian IRS that provides like prior fields to be completed. So that's, I would say, also something to be considered ahead before incorporating the entity in Brazil.
Well, that's Rodrigo. It's an excellent point. And my question to you would be this. So once that initial decision is made, what are the most common corporate structures used by foreign investors in Brazil, and why do those structures tend to work best in practice?
All right, so the most common structure is a limited liability company, limitada, what we call in Portuguese. So it's like a company that it's very simple. It's the cheapest one because you don't need to publish the financial statements. You don't need, to have costs with the auditing firms and so on. So it's the most simple structure, limitada, limited liability company. It can have only one shareholder, only one. So that's possible under Brazilian Civil Code. But as we mentioned, it needs to bear a local representative and also at least one officer locally in Brazil. I would say that's the most common, simple structure. The costs are low. I mean, there's not much debate on this topic. The other one that's, I would say, it's more complex because it has a higher governance structure is a joint stock company, what we call in Portuguese a sociedade anônima. So the joint stock company is similar to a corporation in the US. It could have the shares traded in the stock exchange or not necessarily, right? So it could be a closely held company in Brazil. And that company needs to publish the financial statements. It usually has a board of directors on top of the officers. So that's why usually it's a type of company that's, I would say, typically has a higher governance in general terms compared to the limitada, even though nothing prevents the limited liability company in Brazil also to have a robust governance structure. But still, the Sociedade Anônima, the joint stock company in Brazil, typically is used, I would say, for larger business enterprises, when there's a reason to have maybe more disclosure, or if there's a regulated market. Usually then the client can consider a joint stock company rather than a limited liability company. So those are the most typical business structures in Brazil to set up an ILCO.
Well, thank you for all those guidance. It's very important for the ones who are listening us from abroad. And in terms of capital and funding, right? Is there any minimum capital requirement to set up a company in Brazil? And how do foreign investors usually think about capitalizing a new co from abroad?
All right. So in terms of the capital requirement, as a general rule, there's no minimum capital requirement unless it's a regulated sector, such as financial markets, aviation, oil and gas. So it will depend on what the company will do in Brazil. So I would say if it is like a tech company or a services company in general, there's no minimum capital requirement. So to answer that, we will need to understand what the entity will do in Brazil to see if there's any specific regulation that requires a minimum capital in Brazil. So having said that, I would say that it's very common if there's no specific minimum capital requirement, like to set up the entity with a very low minimum capital, like 1,000 Brazilian reais or something like that, which would be like 200 USD, more or less. So then the capital can be only subscribed by the incorporation and paid up later. That's also possible. So not necessarily the funds need to be remitted within Brazil by the day of the incorporation. So that's something that we can also discuss later on. But so generally speaking, we can like only say that we are subscribing, for instance, a low amount to be paid up later within 1 year or so. That will depend on the business structure. But I would also say that if the idea is to start running from day zero, for sure it would be recommended, to pay up minimum capital for the local transactions because the company needs to be running. So if the idea is like to start from zero with something, for sure the foreign shareholder should remit the funds as soon as possible for the company to start doing business in Brazil.
Okay, excellent. So our next topic would be inflow and outflow of funds. And for ones abroad who are listening to us, they might get used to that 1976 hit from the Eagles called Hotel California. And the final iconic line of the song is, "You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave." Is this the case in Brazil? From your perspective, or how does the inflow and outflow of funds actually work under Brazilian law?
That's a very good line. It used to be like that, mainly until the 90s or so in Brazil. Nowadays, in 2026, and since the 20 since this, I would say this century, right? It's much easier for the inflow and the outflow of funds to happen because I would say so. First, for the inflow of funds and the outflow, so the capital needs to be registered with the Central Bank of Brazil. That's very important. So it's like control, but it's not something that the central bank, can define if the monies will be sent out or not. So it's merely registration that's important, that needs to be done, but there's nothing that the Central Bank of Brazil can do to prevent the client from sending the money in or out of Brazil. So I just think out loud here that also it's important that so the money can be sent to Brazil via a capital infusion. That's one thing. So it's very common, like that we mentioned. So the capital injection would happen, right, for the money to be within Brazil, within the company. And it's also possible, generally speaking, to have like the inflow of funds via a loan agreement. So that's also possible, and that also needs to be registered with the Central Bank of Brazil under specific registrations. So that's for the inflow of funds. For the outflow of funds, the most common structure would be to remit them as dividends, and that's something that we can discuss further on, because since I would say January 2026, and there's a debate from the Supreme Court, maybe that could be extended until February. We're seeing that happening, but basically there's a specific law in Brazil saying that now there's a tax percent. Now there is a 10% tax rate for sending dividends out of Brazil for any foreigner. So it used to be zero since the 90s, and now there's a 10% rate. So that's very important for any foreigner to know, that if the client decides to remit the funds back from Brazil to the US or to the UK or to any other foreign jurisdiction, there will be a tax percent rate for the dividends remittance. Other than that, I mean, there are specific structures like services agreement or so. It would be possible to have like services providing, like an intercompany agreement between companies. That's possible. So the funds would be sent as a service, rather than dividends. That's, I would say, those are the most common structures. For sure, there could be differences like specific investments or so. But to summarize, the inflow and the outflow of funds needs to be registered with the Central Bank of Brazil. But there's no like control in terms of the regulator deciding what will or not be sent in or out of Brazil. That's basically how we handle legally nowadays.
So you can check out and leave, right?
Yes, you can. Yes, you can.
Because in some Latin American countries, this was not the case, or used not to be the case, right? Especially in Argentina, recently they changed this, but from a long time, you couldn't take money out of the country, right? So
yes,
just to be clear, that's not the case with Brazil. And one important thing is to have a tax support, a lawyer in Brazil assisting the foreigners with the tax deals here in Brazil, because depending on the way the money is remitted to other countries, you would have different tax rates, right? So for your tax planning, it's very important to have someone experienced in tax in Brazil, right? So the last question is legal protection and risk, right? And from a risk management perspective, which legal areas deserve the most attention from foreign investors? For example, labor, tax that we just talked about, regulatory issues, and what are the biggest mistakes to see in practice?
All right, that's a very good question, Renato. I would say that, first of all, as we mentioned before, you can leave as long as there's no local liability. So if there's any local liability, that could be tax, labor, environmental, consumer protection in Brazil. So we have specific laws depending on the matter. So if there's a foreign shareholder, for instance, that has any discussion or any dispute regarding any of those matters or any legal matter in Brazil, that local representative that we've mentioned in the beginning of the conversation would receive a service of process depending on the matter, and that person even could have his or her account frozen if there's any dispute in Brazil. That can happen. So that's why not everyone is comfortable with being the local representative of a foreign shareholder, because it will depend on the structure and the liabilities. So in this scenario, what I would mention is that the key areas for a foreigner to be generally aware in Brazil, for sure, tax. Brazilian taxes are generally high, so tax planning is very important beforehand, before structuring the entity, if possible. The accounting firm to be hired locally is also important, because even if the company is doing nothing, it needs to send reports to the Brazilian tax authority saying that, that the company is doing nothing. So, and there are fines if the company doesn't send those monthly reports. So tax for sure is a key area to understand and consider a tax planning, also depending on the foreign shareholder jurisdiction and so on. The second thing I would point out to labor. Brazilian labor law are generally also very protective for the employee, meaning the employee vis-a-vis the employer under Brazilian labor courts is highly protected, right? So we could say that the burden of proof relies on the employer and not on the employee. So the company needs to have all the labor registrations, records, and the law is very specific since the 1940s. So it's a very, I would say, old law, but still with court decisions that are, maybe there was a labor reform recently, like 20, I don't remember, like 2018, 2019, but something along those years. So recently, but still the labor is a key matter in Brazil, labor. The employees. Also, depending on the sector, like consumer protection. So if there's a B2C service, we also have a specific consumer protection code. So the client, similarly to labor law, are deemed as someone to be protected. So we have also that specific code. If there is a B2C entity in Brazil, it should be really aware of that. And I could also add environmental, which will for sure depend if there's any environmental subject in the business of the entity. If so, we also have very specific environmental law with the possibility of the company being liable under Brazilian law. And we also have other specific laws like general data protection law in Brazil. There we have compliance law. So that will depend on what the company will do. But the key thing is, even with those specific laws, we can say that Brazil is a jurisdiction that is fostering foreign investments as we speak. We've seen that the emerging markets in general, the money is coming to those countries. And even with those, I would say, I wouldn't say difficulties, but rather it's important to have someone to help clients to navigate in Brazilian laws and regulations. And for sure, there's plenty of opportunity, plenty of room for new business entities in Brazil. That's what we have been seeing recently. So even just to mention that it is maybe challenging, but it's less challenging if the client has someone to handle the matters locally and to help them do business in Brazil. And I think those are the key matters to be aware of generally.
Okay, yeah. So thank you very much, Rodrigo. Rodrigo is a well-experienced lawyer who has helped many foreign clients doing business in Brazil. So that's bring us the end of today's episode. We hope this conversation helped clarify some of key fundamentals foreign investors should understand before setting up a company in Brazil, and more importantly, helped frame the right questions to ask before taking that first step. So guys, if you found this episode useful, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and follow our channel so you don't miss future conversations like this. We regularly explore topics at the intersection of investment, law, compliance, governance, risk, always with a practical, real-world focus. So thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode. Thank you, Rodrigo.
Thank you very much. We'll keep in touch.
Então, muito obrigado pela atenção. A gente falou aqui sobre algumas armadilhas que devem ser evitadas, né, nos fluxos de dinheiro de entrada do Brasil, saída do Brasil, quais são as estruturas corporativas mais comuns que podem ser adotadas pelos estrangeiros, alguns aspectos importantes que o investidor ou a empresa estrangeira que queira fazer negócio no Brasil deve se atentar, inclusive antes mesmo de começar, certo? Então, se você gostou do nosso episódio, se você gostou do conteúdo que a gente trouxe aqui, né, se inscreva no canal ou compartilhe este episódio com quem tem interesse em fazer negócio no Brasil. Até o próximo, um abraço.